Welcome to today's webinar, Beyond the Bolt, How Cloud-Based Solutions Have Transformed Procurement. I'm your host, Jon Hansen, and today I want to, and Toby, our producer, is going to be moving the slides for us as well as controlling the polls that you'll be dealing with. Toby, can you go on to the next slide if you could? There we go. We're going to be joined by guest panelists. I'm going to start off with Sheena Donaldson, welcoming her to this webinar. Sheena is with CIPS, and maybe if you could, rather than going through the bolt or the lengthy version, give us a brief minute of overview of yourself and your organization.
Okay, so CIPS aims to support our members. We have a global membership of procurement professionals with best guidance materials to support them in their day-to-day roles, give them materials that support them with delivering information back to the board and enhancing the professional profession.
Perfect. Well, welcome. And you know, we've shared these virtual airwaves before, so I'm very much looking forward to your input on what will be an interesting discussion. Also joining us, and if we could go on to welcome Tim Cummins from IACCM. Toby, cue in the slide. Thank you. Tim, welcome once again. Much like with Sheena, if you could just share a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, John. So, yes, President of IACCM, International Association for Contract and Commercial Management. Our purpose is to raise the quality and integrity of trading relationships. So we too are a global organization, some 54,000 members in 173 countries. And we undertake extensive research, we provide extensive training. I think perhaps most importantly, as you will know, John, we are, I think, unique in bringing together the buyer and the provider communities as a single professional body to try and really create that drive for more collaborative and more open and transparent trading relationships.
And that, of course, all begins, Sheena and Tim, that all begins with sharing information and insight as to where the market is going. And to help us to do that and facilitate that today, I'd like to welcome our gracious host, Alun Rafique from Market Dojo. Alun, welcome. And much the same way, give us a little bit of background on yourself.
Oh, hi there. My name's Alun. Originally started off as an engineer and fell into procurement, as I think a lot of procurement professionals do. I had some experience in sales and marketing and consultancy in the procurement sector. And then myself and a couple of other wonderful colleagues and co-founders, we started Market Dojo, initially with a view to making e-auctions more accessible to a wider audience through a pay-as-you-go solution. And since then, the last 9 years, we've transformed what we do and evolved what we do to provide a real tool set to procurement professionals. So now we help people with e-sourcing and supplier engagement. We've got a really nice team here. We've got a great client base. We really help people collect information, and manage that information and negotiate with their suppliers. So yeah, very excited to be here today.
Great, thank you so much, Alun. And of course, yours truly, again, Jon Hansen. I am your humble moderator. I won't go into my background. You can sort of read it quickly or just Google my name with regards to that. But looking very forward to, again, moderating this discussion today, because I think it's very important. And in fact, let's go to the slide of where we're going to be focusing on the 3 areas in this Beyond the Bolt webinar. By the way, a quick reminder, after the webinar, we've created a hashtag for a tweet chat, and that hashtag is SaaSBolt, as you can see on the screen. Now, one of the great things about the tweet chats is long after the webinar has completed, the discussion points expand to include other people and the general market and some additional industry experts who will weigh in on what we're talking about today. So I would encourage you at your convenience to check this out. The conversation or discussion often goes on a week or 2 after the webinar, but again, mark that hashtag SaaSBolt on your screen. And let's go to today's agenda if we could. Now we're going to focus on 3 areas. What procurement looked like before Gartner's postmodern ERP world. Now, some of you may or may not be familiar with what this postmodern ERP world is, and we're going to give you some background on the history of procurement, where we started in terms of the ERP-driven platforms. Many of you probably are still on that type of platform, but we're going to give you a background as to where Gartner sees the industry, where it's from, and ultimately where it's going. What did it look like after Gartner's postmodern ERP world with the introduction of cloud-based or SaaS solutions? And of course, what should your procurement practice look like today? I mean, in the virtual green room before our conversation, we talked about cloud, both private and public cloud, on the ground, computing on the edge. There's a lot of things that are happening in a world that is being transformed digitally, especially the procurement practice. And we want to give you an idea as to where that industry is today, where it's going, and how to align yourself with the transformation that's occurring out there. Now, I want to remind you of a couple of things. This is not a passive environment here. So while we encourage you and enjoy you obviously to listen, we also want to invite you to participate in our polls when they come up, as well as to ask questions or post comments on what you hear throughout the entire webinar. I'll be monitoring both the chat facility and the question facility. So if you have a comment, if you have any idea, and I'll be posting questions to you as well, please, again, interactive, get involved, because we want your input on this as well. You are part of the discussion. Although we'll be imparting our expertise and knowledge, again, we want your feedback in terms of what's happening. Toby, let's go to the first slide there. Perfect. Before, on the outside looking in. And when I talk about that, when we're talking about that today, in many instances, you know, procurement has rarely in the past been involved actively in the platforms and the technologies and the manner in which they literally automated, or the automation of the procurement process within an organization. And the first poll question that's going to be coming up, and the one we're going to ask you right off the bat, is going to be, again, what was your involvement? And Toby, I want to cue that one if I could as well, please. There we go. What level of involvement did your procurement organization have with regard to selecting your current procurement solution? Significantly involved, moderately, or somewhat? And while you do that, and I think we're going to leave it open for about a minute or so, I want to start with Sheena and going in the background. In the past, one of the greatest laments from procurement people has been, why haven't we been part of the selection process? In other words, someone else, IT or finance, made the decision, especially with an ERP-based solution, made the decision as to what platform, and it was sort of thrust upon us. I mean, why did that happen back then, do you think?
I think historically, unfortunately, procurement teams could often have been seen as a potential bottleneck, or a department that will say no to certain areas of spend. And the organisation does need to move on and develop. So you'll find that systems were adopted to meet other organisational needs, and procurement weren't necessarily interfaced with as a valid stakeholder. Unfortunately, like you say, that can present a few challenges for procurement when systems do go live and they don't have all the features or requirements required to manage spend.
Okay, but now this is an interesting point, and Tim, I want to dovetail this into you, and then I'll go to you, Alun. I mean, one of the things you had mentioned, Tim, and hearing what Sheena said, is bringing together people in a sort of a knowledge sharing environment. I mean, obviously, procurement people, was that more that the role was seen as a functional or a transactional approach to purchasing, where there was no strategic value or input? They were more or less getting marching orders?
Yeah. I think that's probably a fair summary in many cases. Clearly, there are organizations and individuals within organizations who take a very sort of strategic view and really do contribute actively to the business. But I think, building on what Sheena said, the truth is that the growth of procurement and its status was really driven by it being invested with a certain level of power, and its fairly dogmatic and limited measurement systems around driving out cost, which of course translated to low price and achieving high levels of compliance. So I'm not sure I would agree that procurement didn't have much involvement in systems. I think it often did, but I think it had a very narrow view of what those systems should be doing and the value they should be delivering. So obviously it's been the growth of things like P2P, which are pretty inflexible and are really inhibiting procurement's ability to move forward and change its value equation.
So in other words, and the lack of involvement was more or less between the narrow definition of where procurement should be involved, as opposed to an exclusion of it. So Ellen, going to you on this, and we're seeing the poll results coming up right now. Going to you, was that largely due to the fact the narrow scope of the view of procurement's functionality? Was it largely the result of the fact that most of the ERP systems in the past were driven by either finance or IT? Listening to what Sheena and Tim had said, what is your take? And the numbers that are coming up are quite interesting.
That's right. I think if the last 2 points you mentioned there, John, I think are very pertinent. So, I mean, I think back to my time at Rolls-Royce when they implemented SAP as their ERP application, a very robust application, although it seems to have been driven from a desire to contain the data in one location and report on that data, mainly driven by the finance and senior management. And I think that's a very important view, and I think procurement did get involved in it to an extent, but it wasn't a major piece of the specification. So what happens is the ERP solutions tend to get implemented with the procurement section being the bolt-on, and the benefits for the end user don't really come about. And I think that's really important, that the usability and the interface to allow procurement to interface with it and obtain an ROI doesn't really happen because the end user wasn't thought of when the drivers for that ERP system were decided.
All right. So in essence, and let's close off the poll here, and can we post the results if we could on there? We're waiting. There we go. 17% significantly involved. 33% moderately involved, 28%, and only 20% not involved. How many of you are surprised by this?
I'm actually surprised there's it's so high, significantly involved, actually. So it's good to see.
Now, what do you think contributed to that? And by the way, I want to pose a question out to you, and certainly and join us in the chat who voted. I mean, what area or what level of involvement did you have with your organization's process? How were you involved? And we'll monitor the chat if you have any comments to add or questions relative to that. So a little bit surprised on the significant. How about you, Tim? I mean, is this skewed? Maybe if we had taken this poll 5 years ago, it would have been much different than it is today. Is this a sign of a shift in thinking and expanding on that scope that you had talked about, Tim? Or is this a reflection of the P2P technology that's coming into play? I mean, how would this have been? How is this different from, let's say, 5 years ago? What would have brought about these types of responses? Because I was surprised a little bit by the amount of involvement.
Okay, I don't think I am particularly, but maybe it depends on what we're thinking in terms of the total procurement solution. I do understand, and I mean, I think that this is the most business function, to be honest. ERP was imposed whether they wanted it or not, and I'm not sure that many business functions actually wanted it. But moving on from there and looking at perhaps the elements that are more specifically procurement solutions, my experience would be that this very much, I think, in line with these results.
Okay, Alan, any surprises here from your part?
I mean, I think they kind of perhaps reflect the changing role of procurement within an organization, and maybe also reflect perhaps the audience that involve themselves in these webinars are perhaps more a proactive audience for more proactive organizations where procurement has a higher reputation. I think it was certainly yes, commonality with the view that procurement is becoming higher thought of within these organizations.
Would this, given your background, going back to Rolls-Royce, would this have been different 5 years ago, the response, do you think?
I think 5, 10, 15, 20. Yeah, absolutely. I think traditionally these applications, ERP applications, were driven by probably a finance side of things and required for the reporting level. And I think procurement now is a much bigger stakeholder in those decisions.
All right. Well, let's move on to the next slide here. Thank you, Toby. One of the things that was interesting, and this is a CPO agenda discussion roundtable, and one of the things that came out is that one strategic business thinker with the right skills is worth 10 to 12 your normal run-of-the-mill purchasing people. And let's go to the next slide on this, Toby, as well. And in terms of this, the reference, one of the CEOs said that when he was with a company before and he was very much involved at the front end of the capital expenditure, whereas when he moved over to Nestle, he was basically told, this is what we've decided, go and do marching orders. So going back into that response, I guess, Ellen, what you're really saying is back then it was more or less the functional side of things, is this is what you're going to be doing. Strategic thinker. When they talk about a strategic thinker in terms of that, and this is back in 2007, 12 years ago, is it the evolution of the procurement professional that has brought that about, Sheena? Like, have we gotten the seat at the table? Have we become more involved to reflect in the data because we ourselves have become more strategic versus buying and selling it, or buying at the best price?
I think you're absolutely right there, John. I think the profession has evolved significantly in the last 10 years. Procurement is starting to see more directors, and that's more significant in certain sectors than others. But as soon as procurement is recognised for the spend management and the strategic approach that they can bring to the organisation and the managing of costs and spend, the more they're being endorsed and the more they're getting a voice at the top table and starting to be involved in the larger picture of running an organisation. So yeah, I do think it's significantly increased in the last few years.
So in what degree, and I'll go to you, Alan, and then to you, Tim, in what degrees do you think technology has played a role in this? Because we're going to go into the next section talking about the postmodern ERP era after the fact, but is technology a facilitator of that? Having more data, more intelligence available. So it's a meeting of both increasing competency with ease of access. Because in the old days with ERPs, and correct me if I'm wrong, but extracting information out of this, one of the greatest laments is by the time we got that data, it was already outdated and we couldn't use it. I mean, is that the meeting of the perfect storm, so to speak?
I think it's the recognition of the need for that data and the technology combined. I mean, if you look at, I always take the analogy to salespeople. So sales and organizations of any size generally need salespeople. So as organizations grow, you need to report on forecasting to the finance side of things. So most salespeople will use a CRM system, for example, for that reporting purposes. However, you don't normally start an organization of 3 people with a procurement arm, and so traditionally when organizations have grown, they haven't had procurement divisions and they haven't had the requirement necessary for that data. But as the understanding of the importance of procurement and savings grows and technology can reinforce it, then I certainly think that's helped to drive a change in the adoption of technology within the sector, because they understand that they need to report towards the finance side, and they understand more that the CPOs, procurement directors, procurement people feed into that, and so that is helping to develop the requirement for the proper tools.
Okay, well, as we progress to the next slide, Tim, based upon what Sheena and Alan had indicated, I mean, is that reflected in your view of what's happening within the corporation, that it's becoming less siloed? I mean, generally speaking, not just in the procurement realm, but overall with the in operations, where traditional silos of limiting functionality, now people are required to take a more holistic view. Is that happening?
Oh, I would say the market is absolutely crying out for that more holistic, more integrated view. I'm not sure I see it happening in any dramatic context right now. If anything, I think it's often getting worse. To give examples, you know, in my career, it was very difficult to even find a lawyer in the company to talk to. Nowadays, if you want to make a decision, you're probably talking to a coven of lawyers because they've all developed such high levels of specialism. I think as you look at what's happened within procurement, again, the segmentation and fragmentation within procurement has moved from the generalist to the increasing specialist, which often, obviously tends to create some real challenges. That's why I suppose the newer technologies that we're going to talk about in a moment are really so important and so exciting. And my final point, I think, would be the organizations where we really see meaningful progress, I think, have stopped. Of course, it's the danger of words. Many of them have stopped talking about procurement and think much more in terms of supply management, which is often obviously a much more holistic activity that really does look at whole life cycles. I think those organizations where procurement is struggling are those where it's still stuck in the box of just procuring stuff without any real understanding or, to be honest, interest in whether or not the stuff that they acquire is really the right thing. And that's particularly true as we look at this juggling and shift from what was traditionally direct procurement into more and more services and indirect procurement.
So in essence, okay, now I want to return back to the slide, for example, and I want to go through these ones quickly, Toby. We talk about it back in 2007 where Ariba was entering into the on-demand realms. And let's go to the next slide, Toby. And then talking about the smaller ERP providers moving and being more adaptive. Have we looked at the technological breakthrough? Has that caused a shift within the organization? You know, Sheena, organizations are structured by a hierarchy, the way they used to function. Now technology seems to be more accessible to everybody, and has these smaller companies, and has predicted by Gartner, which was leading into the postmodern ERP era, these smaller companies provide greater accessibility to more people to be able to become involved in the process from the beginning. I mean, is that a driving factor here?
It can be if the historical legacy systems aren't filling the needs for procurement, so they can't deliver the outputs required by them, then they will look for bolt-on systems. But what procurement professionals are looking for is flexibility now. They're aware at the speed at which their organisations are developing. They don't want to necessarily anchor themselves down to a large-scale tech solution if it's not going to be evolved and progress over the coming years. And that's what procurement professionals are looking for, that element of flexibility with the new tech.
Okay, so now let's advance a little bit, because I want to go to you, Ellen, on this, and as we progress to the next slide. One of the things, and let's go over one more slide there, Toby. One of the things that's interesting, and I want to go to this case study, is the involvement of people tying things in, and the impact of legacy systems. Collaboration within the group with EVA, which was a very successful program. And Tim, you were on the panel discussion in Virginia before. They talked about the fact is that the technology is a tool to use, but with the ERP legacy systems, the focus was on making the software work and justifying the expenditure and the cost of that. With the emerging systems, you've removed those factors. And I mean, Ellen, going back from your history with Rolls-Royce, a larger company, I mean, when organizations invest significant money into an initiative, isn't there greater pressure on them to make it work, even if they're having difficulties with it? And doesn't it make them less nimble and adaptive to what really are the requirements?
Absolutely. I mean, I think when Sheena said about flexibility, it was very, very true. I mean, change is difficult. Driving change. If we're all good change managers, I think we make our fortune. And you've got to look at the elements which impact change within an organisation, and that's the technology, that's the processes, etc. And I think if you have a system which is large and cumbersome, being designed by people who aren't in your area, bringing about change is very difficult, and if you have application providers who are more designed for example, by procurement professionals for procurement professionals, then managing that change is much easier. And I think the change management is difficult, but it can be facilitated by having the best of breed technology to assist that.
Well, now here, and let's lead into our next section here, because the interesting point you raised there, Alun, is this: ERP systems aren't going away. I mean, they still exist. They're still a part of the process, an important part of the process, obviously. But as we look into walking through the door and taking more of an active role in our next poll, who had the greatest influence on the decision to acquire your current procurement platforms? Was it the CFO, CPO, or CIO, or were all three involved equally? And the reason we raise this as we activate the poll here is, Tim, if you look at that communication, you mentioned earlier, well, those silos are still there. Well, I was of the opinion myself that they're dissolving away. You mentioned that they are still there. If you make a decision in a vacuum, does that mean, within the context of what you said, that if the CFO is making the decision or the CIO is making the decision, that procurement is still going to be on the outside looking in because they're focusing on what technology they're familiar with? Or alternatively, is the advent of technology, is it no longer just the CPO realizing the advent of on-demand solutions, SaaS solutions, but the CFO and CIO are equally aware of it? Does that perhaps act as a conduit to taking down those silos that you mentioned still exist?
John, the exciting thing for me about the technologies that are emerging, and particularly around cloud, is the ability to think much more in terms of platforms. And I think it's important that we start thinking much more about technology as a business application, not as a functional application. Otherwise, again, we're reinforcing the silo. And there are some, I think, really exciting developments going on in terms of some of those technologies. If procurement is going to flourish, it has to think of itself in the context of the business and the users of their support. I think the big shift for many procurement groups is they've got to move away from trying to use technologies and so on to reinforce themselves in a position of power, and they've got to think about technology to move them to a position of enablement. The more that a function can do to support the work of others without the need for review and approval, etc., the more they're going to flourish.
Okay, now I have to, Sheena, shifting this over to you, and then Alun yourself, is that flourishing that Tim is referring to, does that not directly have, or at least to some degree directly have, an impact on the fact is, as we're no longer relying on ERP legacy systems, and in a slide coming up, we'll talk about the fact that with the Gartner analysis, many will view legacy ERP systems as an anchor that actually held back procurement. But with what the SaaS solutions do, again, does that facilitate that movement of collaboration? I mean, we have interesting mix here on the survey so far that's coming up. 40% or 45% say CFOs are involved, 27% CPO. Interesting enough, 0% say CIOs are involved, which I want to talk about. But is the advent of the new technologies that was a one-time considered bolt-on, but now is becoming the dominant driver? I mean, does that remove those silos? Does that create that collaboration and flourishing that Tim referred to?
I think what we have to identify initially is that organizations are moving quickly. They're fast moving in their markets. They're having to meet their customers' needs and they're having to stay competitive. What procurement professionals are having to be aware of is that their profession is changing. They're having to adapt their skills. They need the right technologies on board so they can be responsive and reactive and align themselves very quickly to an organization's strategy. If they are slow and sluggish in their response, they can actually hold back development opportunities. And again, it's a competitive market, and organizations need to be able to respond and be reactive. So procurement teams need to be on board with that completely. And then making sure they have the right technology to be able to leverage it in a way that they can be responsive and reactive and meet internal stakeholders' needs is imperative. Are the old legacy systems holding back? Sometimes they can be cumbersome, but that's not to say there aren't bolt-on solutions or opportunities to achieve those quick wins that are needed.
Okay, so I've got to do this, and Toby, let's close off the poll, and Alun, I want to go to you because and if we could, let's share the results. There we are. CFOs 38% involved, 31% CPOs, all three equally, nothing for CIOs. So let's go back to the screen here, with all of us on screen. Alun, I mean, first of all, did these results surprise you? Secondly, let me ask you this question, because you come from a background of being in procurement with a large organization, being with legacy systems and all of these other elements. I mean, if you look at this, the CIO isn't even involved, according to our survey response. I mean, isn't that kind of surprising?
Yeah, surprising and pretty frustrating for all the CIOs out there as well, I imagine. I mean, it just, the technology's changing so rapidly. A lot of SaaS solutions can be purchased as bolt-ons, as you say, and traditionally they're kind of a bolt-on, bolt-off, and the CIOs don't need to necessarily get involved with that. But then, as we're going to discuss further, when they start becoming the linchpins within the organizations, I think the CIOs probably want to be more involved with that. So that must be relatively frustrating that they're not more involved. And I think that's something which organizations need to look at.
Well, and as we go to the next slide, Toby, I want to bring up something. Gartner published a report in which they said that CMOs, chief marketing officers, will actually be spending more on technology investment than CIOs will be. Think about that. That came out with Gartner. A recent study came out, and they said it's a matter of touch points. In essence, with CMOs, it's with the customer who they're making the inter and direct relationship with on that standpoint. I mean, is this the gravitation away from CIOs? And Sheena, I'll go to you. Is this a gravitation away from CIOs, and that strategic thinking is that marketing is best to interface with the customer, buyers and procurement is best to interface with suppliers and manage the supply chain? I mean, are we seeing a fragmentation of the IT duties where they become a more, would you call, facilitator of technology more than driving the technology?
I'd like to think the CIOs weren't pushed out of the equation. It's important that they are engaged with. They're a key stakeholder in any new tech that's been brought into an organization, especially from a risk perspective and a general understanding of what tech solutions are being used. If marketing pursue one tech solution and it doesn't interface very well with procurement or finance's solution, actually it can bring problems and challenges in its own right. So it's kind of integral that all parties sit and have a central discussion before any new technologies are onboarded.
Okay, so now going from the past and looking, and we all talked about this, the lack of involvement of procurement, it's like the pendulum is going in the other way. But Tim, when we talk about strategic contributor and insights and getting involved, are procurement people ready to assume that driving responsibility? And the way, if you look at CMOs spending more on IT and driving those initiatives, are we in the position as procurement people, number one, to be able to take and assume that responsibility and run with it? And then after Tim responds, I'm going to go to you, Alun, and say, does the technology make it easier for procurement professionals to do that? So Tim, to you first.
Well, these are enormous topics, aren't they? And of course, it's always very dangerous to generalize because, of course, there are some individuals who absolutely are poised to go, desperate to go, and there are others, it's very much like the observations that have been made. I think it was Warren Buffett who talked about the innovators, the imitators, and the rest. And, every function you look at, Sheena, I'm sure you find just the same as you look at your membership. You probably have around 5% who are highly engaged, really wanting to push out, go to the fore, be innovators. You've got another 15% or so who really are observing, they're actively involved, but they're going to follow, they're going to imitate. And then you've got the long tail of people who really would rather be left in peace if they could be, to get on with the job that they've been used to and trained for. So I think we're all struggling with that and with that development, that dynamic. I think there's no question that people are constrained today by the technologies they have, the inadequacies of those technologies to deal with volatile, fast-changing markets, the uncertainty, the constant change, the big shift that there's been, massive shift that there's been away from a product acquisition to services acquisition. It's a fundamentally different proposition. And yet the systems that most people have, often thanks to Gartner, to be blunt, are completely inappropriate to the market as it is. So, as I think you know, John, I'm rather a skeptic, I'm afraid, about Gartner's views on anything very much, because in the field of procurement, they got it badly wrong.
Okay, so Alun, looking at you, and so part of what you said, Tim, just to reflect back is, and Toby, let's advance to the next slide. Part of what you said is that when you look at where technology is going and having procurement professionals in the position to be able to assume greater responsibility, the limitations of technology and getting it wrong has been a hindrance in procurements. The professionals, not only contribution and involvement, but their ability to develop to meet the changing needs of a global supply chain. Because of this, as you say, Gartner getting it wrong in wrong direction. So if we add on that, Alun, I mean, doesn't that mean that the new technologies that are emerging, that are simple, that don't hinder people, doesn't that mean to a certain degree that it empowers greater involvement and greater understanding, and that buyers are not low-level buyers anymore, but they become more strategic, and those masses, and those numbers are true what Tim said, 5% are the innovators, 15% are the followers, and the rest are sort of like, just let me do my job. I mean, the market is changing. Are we streamlining down what a procurement professional is in terms of using that technology to becoming more strategic? And those who don't won't be around.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought process, that the actual technology that traditionally has been there when it hasn't been designed by procurement people has actually limited how procurement professionals can act. And I think what we need to look at is, I think this procurement within an organization and what they do is considered of more value in today's organizations. And I had a really good chat with the team just before this webinar, actually, and we bounded some ideas about. And for us to become more important within an organization, I think a lot of procurement departments want more compliance. They want results, and traditionally the systems that they've had in place haven't enabled that change in role of procurement within an organization. And now procurement departments are looking at other applications, bolt-on applications, if you were, to facilitate the increased visibility of procurement as a profession within an organization. So traditionally, the technology which procurement professionals have had in place haven't allowed them to have the compliance of the data or bring about an ROI quickly for organizations. So naturally, they've looked outside for other solutions. Traditionally, they've been withheld from doing that, but now there are applications out there that they can get their hands on, and they can use to get the results that they need to drive their profession forward, which helps increase the visibility of procurement within an organization.
Okay, that's an interesting point. And Sheena, I want to ask you this, and as we advance to the next slide, first of all, is it fair to call these solutions bolt-on solutions anymore? I mean, because that would imply to me that it's all ERP based and everything sort of plugs into the ERP. And as we're going to a cloud-based world where it's either private cloud, public cloud, moving to the edge, and talking about that a little bit in the green room. I mean, are we looking at it in the right light, that it's not really bolt-on solution, but it's a progression of technology that brings about a more capable procurement professional? Like this example here, today's procurement professionals, 4.0 grade average, university, sustainability, procurement profession, they have a greater background and depth. Whereas if you look in the past, a lot of people actually fell into procurement by chance. It wasn't a career choice. Now it's a career choice. I mean, is it the fact, Sheena, that these technologies are really catching up to what the emerging procurement professionals are expecting, because they're more tech savvy and thus they're driving the technology, or is technology driving the profession? Do you know what I mean by that?
I do know exactly what you mean by that, because there's so much technology in our day-to-day lives and people know what the capabilities are of tech. So why would they want want to come into a workplace and work with a legacy or an antiquated system that's not delivering results, that doesn't allow a procurement professional to be proactive, which is what they want to be seen as. They want to be endorsed, recognised as a professional, and be delivering results for their organisation. So they do have to open sometimes quite tricky conversations with, do we bolt on to the system that we've got? Do we work around and put sticky plasters over a legacy system that half-heartedly delivers? And we know we've got to add new areas. I mean, I've worked for organisations that have traditionally still worked on the procurement function via Excel. And it's quite scary that so many organisations heavily use Excel solutions because they've had to as a workaround. But now there are newer generations coming into the profession who are becoming fully qualified. They want to be recognised as a professional, and they're bringing knowledge, enthusiasm, drive and determination to build the profession, and bringing their knowledge with them from an outside influence, as well as working with the systems that they've already got to operate on.
Perfect. Well, and Toby, let's jump ahead to section 3 right now, and go beyond this perspective, because I want to touch on something that was just said. Now, there's a case study here. Before we do, maybe we can go into in detail, Alun, a little bit of the case study, not a lot of time, but a little bit of an idea based on the context of what we were talking about here, because I'm getting this feeling that it's not so much the technology that is shaping or reshaping the procurement professional. It's the procurement professional that's driving the technology to a certain degree, and being able to then interface with the buyer and within the organization suppliers. That's really, I see that chain happening. Does that make sense, Alun, in relation to the case study?
Yeah, absolutely. I think technology is a driver to allow an evolution within the business and within the procurement profession.
Okay, so in terms of the case study, and Toby, do we have a case study, a brief overview of this?
Yeah, I could just go a bit into the detail here. So one of our clients, Metroline, they're part of the Comfort Delgro group, one of our oldest customers actually. They're a great example. So they started with us on a pay-as-you-go model, on-demand model, so that you can start with us for £500 a month, and they ran a monthly licensing system where they got real ROI from using our tool to carry out tenders. Metroline is a bus company. They're using us for both direct and now indirect components. And through using us, I think when we talk about is SaaS companies a bolt-on or a linchpin now, I think a lot of times they can still start as the bolt-on, but after, I mean, by definition, a linchpin is something you can't really do without, rather than a bolt-on which you can bolt on, bolt off. And as Metroline have used us, they've grown. There's a lot of customers find in not just in terms of the licensing, but our capability and our product range. So when they start off as the bolt-on, they very much ended up in an area where they find our solutions are inherent to what they need to do within procurement, so within supplier engagement, within e-sourcing, and they find that especially comforting with respect to the challenges that procurement face today. So they have a real need to deliver an ROI, they need to deliver savings, they need to deliver compliance, and they need to demonstrate to Comfort Delgro, for example, their parent company, that they have these systems in place. And with traditional ERP applications, just can't deliver the ROI quickly enough or well enough with the adoption, and that's where Market Dojo really brings benefit to a lot of organizations today. But being the SaaS organization, having starting off as a bolt-on, we find ourselves becoming a linchpin in a lot of these organizations.
Now, is that a trend for SaaS in general, Tim, do you see, and Sheena yourself? Or, I mean, like you mentioned something, Sheena, that I found very interesting, the ERPs in the background system and the limitations they have and the limitation involvement. And going back to that question, I mean, the technology that's driving the way we procure goods and services, I mean, is that a big factor in transitioning or transforming procurement professionals? I mean, is that the influencing factor there, or are procurement professionals coming in saying we need to have this accessibility that we didn't have before? I mean, like, it's a chicken or an egg scenario, if we could. And Toby, please move to the next slide on this. But which is it? Is it technology driving the profession, or the profession now driving technology?
I think, in all honesty, look, you'd have to review it from, I don't want to put this into a generational perspective, but certain generations have grown up with tech. They know its capabilities, and they will push the boundaries a little bit within an organization. They know what they have to deliver from a procurement perspective. They're trained, they're qualified, they know what's required of them. If they haven't got the systems and the capability to deliver that, then they have to take that conversation to the organization to discuss, we have X, Y, and Z system in place. It's inhibiting being able to deliver the right results. If we need to grow as an organization and be proactive rather than reactive, then we have to think about how we invest in new systems and whether we should continue to support a system that, yes, cost possibly millions to implement X years ago, but is it still fit for purpose? And I think that's what procurement professionals are challenging within their organizations now, because they want to deliver the right results.
Now, does that tie into what you said a couple of years ago about the redundancy of procurement professionals, Tim, and 40% of procurement professionals will become redundant after a certain period of time? Is this redundancy that you're talking about? I mean, does the advent of technology and the comfort level to which Sheena is referred to with the up and coming generation, you don't want to make it generational, but I mean, is that really the 1-2 punch that's transforming an organization's procurement practice?
So, John, I think we have to be very careful about that generational issue. I absolutely agree with Sheena that, of course, we now have a generation which actually probably now is pretty much anybody under the age of 40 for sure, who really have brought up with relative ease of technological use at their fingertips. So certainly many people go into the corporate environment today and feel incredibly frustrated by the archaic nature of the tools that they're given, the difficulty of accessing meaningful information, etc. So I think there's a generation that is very frustrated by the archaic, to their point of view, and limiting technology that they discover. I think that's very different from saying, but are they real advocates of massive change? I mean, every year we run a Leaders of the Future program where big corporates put forward 25 people under the age of 30 who they view as the procurement leaders of the future. It is fascinating how few of them have any real knowledge or understanding of emerging technologies. You know, with one of those groups, for example, we said to them, well, how do you see blockchain affecting you? And true, this was a year ago, but not one of them could describe what blockchain was.
Okay, so I have to, let me interrupt there, because this is interesting. I want to go to Alun. Let's go to the next poll, Toby, while I go to Alun on this one. Because I'm hanging on the words of what Tim said, and on what is your procurement platform based? Is it on demand, bridge, ERP? While we get the response from that, does that surprise you that Tim's reference the fact that they don't know what blockchain is, they don't know what the new technologies are? Because again, she is talking about a comfort level of people coming in, a generational element to it, of being a facilitator, introducing new technologies. Tim's talking about the fact that even with some of these up and coming, they're not aware of the newest technology. So if I go to you with this, Alun, as we wait for the response, what are your thoughts? I mean, are we having procurement professionals, and it goes back to that original question, is technology informing procurement professionals, and are procurement professionals taking enough of the lead to understand what the new technology can do, per Tim's statement, or are they coming into organizations ready to make the change? Like for the example with your client study and those who are most responsive to a SaaS solution. I mean, what are the origins of that within an organization? For someone who's listening in here who said, I want to make a move in that direction, I mean, what's the makeup of the organization? Which ones are most conducive to this?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I remember a conversation a number of years ago with someone who'd gone with one of our more traditional competitors, shall we say, and they bought it for a year. I went back to them after the next year and I said, well, how are you doing with it? And they said, well, we haven't used it yet. I said, well, would you like to use an application which is maybe more usable and a faster ROI? And they replied, well, no, we're gonna renew the software because we didn't get the ROI the first year round, and we're trying to try and get the second year round. And that kind of view is changing, and what we find is interesting, the discussion between what's driving what, and I think it's more of a snowball effect. So the younger generation, or more, maybe not even younger generation, but the more proactive people are learning about their technology and its capabilities, which is driving their technology with the providers, which is then driving the people. So I think it's a snowball effect, which is ramping up the evolving technology to satisfy the evolving needs of the procurement professional in today's market. And so I'd say it's kind of all acting together. I mean, we find that actually I'd say our sweet spot in an organization might be, we have customers from 2 million in turnover through to many billion in turnover. Originally we said our sweet spot's going to be 500 mil to a billion in terms of size organization, but what we actually found is not so much the size of the organization that is important, but it's the type of person. And obviously the younger millennial generation tend to be more au fait with technology, but it's the proactive people within procurement who are driving this change. And unfortunately, within the community, there isn't as much interaction between the procurement community to drive that change as fast as we'd like, but it is definitely the proactive people who are driving that change and snowballing the evolution of technology.
Wait, let me interrupt you, because you said, man, I want to go back to Tim and then Sheena, and let's Toby close off the poll and share the results. Tim, you mentioned something, and Alan just tweaked it. You said that in your membership, 5% are innovators, 15% are followers, and the remainder just want to be left alone. If you look at that ratio within the membership framework, is it fair to say it's also reflective of what's in the corporate world itself, or what's in the business world itself, and thus the recognition of that technology and the adoption of that technology, because there's such a narrow funnel of those who are innovators? Would it be reasonable to suggest is that perhaps contributes to the absence of knowledge, and until we widen that 5% and get beyond to a tipping point, that we're going to be sort of stuck in neutral to a certain degree? Do you know what I'm saying, Tim? Hello?
I do much better when I'm not muted. The answer to that, John, I think is absolutely no. I don't think many organizations can actually afford to have that higher ratio of people who are being disruptive all the time, because the truth is there's a lot of work that still has to get done. So any transformation program can only really involve a relatively small portion of people, and it can only cope with a certain number of ideas. And I completely agree with Alan. I think the point here is it's not generational, it's about the person. Some people love change, they love innovation, and some people don't. What we have to do is obviously help those who are not so keen to understand why it's good for them, to help them along the way. I only worked in one place where I would say that the ratio of people, and certainly from their subsequent careers and jobs, this was true. It was one place where there were a lot of very talented people who were constantly pushing for change. That particular company went bankrupt. So I think we do have to be very cautious about just an organization's ability to deal with change and the proportion of people who can be the drivers of that.
Okay. Sorry, can I just interrupt for a moment, Tim? And Toby, if you could go to the next slide, because I want to build on something in terms of Sheena, and we've got about 5-7 minutes left here. Sheena, what you had mentioned is the influence of generational impact coming in, and Alan mentioned the makeup of the people within an organization. And I think this is an important point here. And Tim saying, yeah, but we can't have more than 5% who are the innovators, simply because if we did, you know, the inherent problem with that would be is that it would be anarchy, or as you put, the company went under. But what's the point of expansion then here? You've got 5% innovators, 15% are followers. How do you even have to convert that 65% who just want to be left alone, Sheena? I mean, because those are the people ultimately who are going to have to, I guess, follow through and utilize this technology. To what degree do we have to convert the non-participants? I don't know if we lost Sheena, did we?
Sorry, I'm back. I do apologise.
No problem.
You did lose me.
Did you hear my question there?
Not a thing. Okay. I'm sorry, John.
basically, Alun said what drives technological advancement and improvement within an organization or enterprise is the mindset of the people as much as the technology. Am I correct, Alun, with that?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Tim then said yes, but if we have that, using that 5% of innovators, 15% of followers, and 65% of the dormant masses, so to speak. If we use that particular equation, Tim said it's rather perilous if we have more than 5% who are innovators, because ultimately it can cause an organization to lose focus of what they need to do. And I think you used the example, Tim, of a company that went out of business because they innovated themselves out of business. So Sheena, going into the young people coming in, I guess my question for you is, at what point do you have to convert people to make this happen? Because what Alun's saying is you need the right people. Technology is there. Tim is saying people don't understand blockchain or the new technology, even though they're younger, so non-generational. So ultimately, if you don't want to widen the funnel at the 5% mark and you've got the 15% in there, is the focus on the 65% to increase them and become active followers and engagement?
I think Tim's exactly right. You can't have too much disruption happening within organisations. It can be detrimental at the same time as managing change. What I'm increasingly finding, because I interface quite regularly with our members across the spectrum, from very senior to new emerging members coming into the profession, and there is an appetite, there's a hunger. Procurement people can identify challenges, and then they'll go and seek solutions, but they'll do their research. They want justifiable structures, facts, figures. What is it? How is it going to work? And what I'm seeing more and more so is there's a general expectation that blockchain, for example, will be commonplace in organisations in 10 years' time. That's a general discussion that I'm having with members at the moment. They'll go, yeah, it'll have happened, it'll be there, it'll have been embedded into our systems, processes, and we'll be utilising that technology. So there is a knowledge share that's happening. Procurement professionals are doing their research. They're hungry for information. They want to know what a varied array of solutions are, and then they will look to select and approach their organisation with viable solutions that are a best fit for their organisation. And that's what I'm seeing more and more of. There's an appetite for knowledge and information at the moment.
So increasing that appetite and having that appetite, and as what Tim's saying, the people coming in who don't know about the technology, that increase in appetite will expand the knowledge. Does that pave the way more so for a SaaS provider or a solution provider in the marketplace, Alun? I mean, you know the question I pose. You've got the 5% innovators, but if you don't have the 15% followers or the buy-in by the larger group, or do you need it? I mean, how can you succeed regardless of what the technology is? Or on the other side of the coin is if everybody has a device, and we cited that example earlier of by 2025, it'll be 10 IoT devices per individual person. I mean, is that automatically going to drive adoption and knowledge that seems to be lacking?
Joe, this is kind of a wider discussion on change, and maybe another webinar. One of my kind of bugbears. I mean, when a salesperson goes into a company, they say, I need a system to be able to report to the finance. I need my CRM system. I'm going to use it, going to record conversations, record the data, and I'm going to report on the projection of sales. When procurement people go into department, they don't necessarily go, well, where's my e-sourcing system? Where's my supplier engagement system? A lot of the times it is, where's my email? Because that's traditionally what they've been used, but it doesn't satisfy the requirements of an organization today. And the question which we're kind of hinging upon here is, well, how do you drive that change? Because if we have the 5% of people who are proactive and the rest are not proactive, then is it going to be touchy-feely? Well, you use it, and if it's success, other people will kind of use it, because no one wants to use the word mandated, and maybe mandated is not the right word, but a finance system is mandated to use a finance system, a salesperson is mandated to use a CRM system, but in procurement, the mandating of systems isn't really had, and no one wants to use that word or drive that change through that, and maybe that's not the right way, but it's certain to say that even if you've got the proactive people driving and delivering benefits, we have companies who spend £500 with us to run an auction, and they've a large tier one automotive manufacturer has saved £50 million in an auction, saved £50 million by spending £500 because of a proactive procurement professional, and that has helped the adoption of our system on a wider basis. But is it enough? Is just having the few technology leaders within an organization enough to acquire adoption? Or do we need a different method to drive the adoption of the solutions that actually drive real value within an organization? And that I find quite frustrating, that adoption is, 20 years ago, email was used as a primary form to get quotations in large multinational companies. Today, large multinational companies still use email as a traditional method to find quotations. It's like, how do we drive that change? I think that's really tough.
Okay, now I want to go to this last slide because we're coming up to the last minute or so here. Could we go to the next slide very quickly? And in terms of started on enterprise and becoming, here's the last question I want to pose, because this is a key thing, because it ties into the bolt-on solutions, it ties into technology, and certainly the inroads market Dojo has made. As we have people use more devices, handheld devices, mobile devices, buying through the Amazons of the world, and the experience of saying, why can't I have the same experience in the workplace buying that I do at home? Because that's where the greatest influence, correct me if I'm wrong, and then I'll ask you each just to close on a minute. It transcends position and hierarchy within an organization, apathy and innovation. Everybody is using technology today to buy, to watch TV, to do everything. Digital is there. Is that going to make the discussion we had is converting people over to a certain degree a moot point? Because people will use digital at home, and if they're comfortable with technology at home, they're going to turn around and they're going to say, well, why can't we have this convenience at the office? And so I want to close with this thing because it ties into the advent of the bolt-on solution technology, starting with you, Tim, a minute on that thought there, then Sheena, and then I'll end with you, Alun. I mean, is this all a moot point because everyone's going technology anyway?
Yes, John. We are clearly moving into an on-demand society where users expect to be equipped and expect increasingly to be able to undertake self-service activity. And I think that, as I said, goes back to my key point that the professions that survive in the future will be made up of people who enable others, not people who try to control others.
Good point. And I remember what you once said a few years ago about if you wake up with a cold, you're more likely to consult Google than call the doctor. Sheena, adding on to that thought, I mean, and I know your focus on digital, I mean, it's inevitable, isn't it, that it's going to be transformed? Either you transform or be transformed. I mean, is that an inevitability we all have to recognize?
I think if we reflect on organisations from go back 10, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, there will always be leaders in certain areas, and they're the ones that are thinking differently. How can they maintain a competitive edge? How can they compete in a very busy marketplace? I think what procurement can benefit from is discussing more so about the wins that they've gained from certain solutions, sharing that knowledge within their community more than anything. If they've had a significant saving, then talk to others, speak about it. I think procurement are very good at getting the job done. We're not very good at self-promoting and marketing as much as we could be at the end of the day. But yes, I think tech is going to come on board significantly and more so at a faster pace over the coming years. It's for an organisation and procurement teams making sure you've got the right fit for your organisation so you're best prepared for that growth and development to happen.
Okay, and we finish, Alun, with you in terms of what the question and what Tim and Sheena just said, and looking at this graph of how customers start, the small entry point, quick and convenient, and then expanding the relationship. I mean, is the advent of all this technology at home and that we're driven by digital, I mean, does that pave the way, and is that the perfect point of convergence for a market dojo, let's say, and a SaaS provider to be able to gain traction, whereas before it might have been a little bit more difficult?
I think yes and no. I'd agree with Tim and Sheena there in terms of the technology paving the way and the proactive users, and certainly via the communication. I mean, what that graph shows is something quite unique to ourselves in terms of, because we have this pay-as-you-go model, we're actually used in very large organizations with multiple other systems, but because we've got this pay-as-you-go model, they can use our system, get a real benefit, and then we grow within the organization, and our growth of the organization is what keeps us alive in a lot of ways, and bringing that return on investment. And after we drive that initial value, then it's the promotion, as Sheena and Tim mentioned there, which helps drive the growth of the organization. However, I would say on the other side of things that the change is never as fast as I think procurement need, and I think there's a large question to, how can we affect that change even fast within the organization.
Okay, well, let me just close with this, and we're going to wrap up in 30, 40 seconds. I recently watched a video by Jim Collins, who wrote the book Good to Great, and you're probably all familiar with that. And he said when change happens, there's no such thing as a big bang or a single event, but it's incremental change, the flywheel of gradually introducing till it gains momentum. I mean, is that the formula that procurement professionals are going to see going forward? I think when it comes down to it, having the small entry point, having convenient entry points that mirror their experience at home in convenience and speed, and no longer these overarching implementation periods, are what's going to pave the way to that kind of change. And based on what all you are saying here, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we have to look at the fact that we are being changed by technology. We have to adapt to that technology, and ultimately, through the ease of implementation of that technology, we're going to be able to progress as a profession and share the results. I mean, is that a fair way to sum it up?
I think you're right there, John. Bang
the nail on the head, I hope.
Yeah, I think it's technology does have to progress. It's how fast it will move and how fast it will create that change is going to be interesting to see how it does. I mean, incremental change is certainly one way to do it. And I think when we started 9 years ago now, we saw pay-as-you-go on-demand e-auctions as going massively big, and then they're a fantastic entry point, and they're what most of the organizations use as part of our solutions before looking at the other parts of our solutions, such as the supplier engagement, onboarding, kind of traditional ERP applications. But I think this incremental change, I think in procurement, we're still waiting for the massive momentum towards change with technology. I think it's still, the ERP systems are there. We've got the bolt-on SaaS applications here, and we've got the change happening, but it's still quite slow, quite incremental. And I think there's something happening, and we're kind of waiting for that big shift towards, when a procurement professional joins an organization, the first thing they say is, where are the systems I need to do my job properly? And I think that change is happening. It's not quite, the big bang's not there as maybe we'd like from quite a kind of a solution provider view, but I think, it's almost there.
Well, let's wrap it up, and thank you, Sheena and Tim and Alun, for joining us. And I think, like anything else, when we look at this, it's the start of a conversation here, not a conclusion of one. And as we look at things like doing computing on the edge and consumerizing, as they're now talking about the technology within corporations, I think that this is a good starting point, but there'll be many more conversations to come. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for tuning in and sharing your thoughts via the polls. I now turn it over to my producer, Toby, to bid everyone adieu.
Thank you very much.